The letter was sitting right there on the table when Amos Sawyer walked through the door. He knew it before he even crossed the threshold, knew it the way a man knows when a gun is pointed at his back, that cold, electric certainty that runs along the spine and turns the stomach to water. The afternoon light slanted through the single window of the homestead, catching the pale envelope in a sharp rectangle of gold, and he stopped walking. He stopped breathing. His hand was still on the door frame, knuckles white against the weathered wood, and across the room Winifred Brenner stood at the kitchen table with her back to him, her shoulders very still in a way that told him everything. She had found it. His mouth went dry. Weeks, no, months of careful concealment, of pressing that single folded page into the dark space beneath the loose plank near the hearth, of covering it over with the braided rug and telling himself it was just a temporary hiding place, that he would deal with it soon, that soon was always coming. All of it collapsed in one stuttering heartbeat. Winifred did not turn around. The silence between them was not empty. It was dense and pressurized, the kind of silence that precedes the crack of thunder, and Amos felt it pressing against his chest like a hand. He took one step inside. The floorboard, a different one, not the one he had pried up, groaned under his boot, and still she did not move. "Winifred," he said. His voice came out lower and rougher than he intended, scrubbed clean of every excuse he had ever rehearsed. She turned then slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a woman who has been waiting and deciding all at once. Her dark eyes found him, and they were not filled with the hot fury he had expected, nor the soft grief he had feared. They were filled with something far more terrifying, a quiet, searching stillness, as though she were trying to find the man she thought she knew somewhere inside the stranger standing in her doorway. The letter lay open on the table. He could see his own handwriting from across the room, those cramped, careful letters he had pressed into the page one sleepless night in February. "You had plenty of time," she said. Her voice was steady. That steadiness cost her something. He could see it in the faint tightening around her jaw. "Plenty of mornings and plenty of evenings. You could have handed it to me yourself." Amos closed the door behind him. He did not know what to do with his hands. "I know," he said. "Then tell me why you didn't." And that was the question that opened everything up, the question that sent him back in his mind to the beginning, to the October morning 7 months earlier, when a wagon had come rattling down the red dirt road toward the Sawyer homestead and changed his life entirely. The year was 1878, and the territory of New Mexico was still a place where a man could disappear into the land or reinvent himself from nothing, where the sky ran so wide and blue above the mesa country that it felt like a kind of freedom and a kind of threat in equal measure. The railroad had not yet pushed its iron fingers this far west, and the nearest town of any consequence was Tarbell Creek, a settlement of perhaps 400 souls built around a general store, a livery, a land office, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and 2 saloons that served as everything else. Amos Sawyer was 28 years old that October, and he owned 160 acres of dry scrubland that was slowly, stubbornly, against all reasonable expectation, becoming something. He ran cattle, 40 head, which was not many but was more than he had started with, and grew a kitchen garden, and had built his own house from raw timber hauled down from the slopes of the San Andres Mountains. He had done all of it alone. That was the word that sat in the center of his life like a stone in a stream. Alone. He had come to New Mexico from Tennessee 6 years earlier, following a route that had taken him through grief and displacement, and a war's long aftermath that had hollowed out most of the men he had grown up alongside. His father had died in the war. His mother had followed 2 years later, worn through by sorrow. His older brother Cal had gone west before him and had sent back one letter describing the territory's impossible skies before going silent entirely. Amos had eventually learned, through a mutual acquaintance passing through, that Cal had been killed in a cattle dispute somewhere north of Socorro. By the time he arrived in New Mexico, Amos carried his dead like a second skeleton. He was not a bitter man. He was careful not to be, because he had seen what bitterness did, had watched it eat through his neighbors back in Tennessee the way rust eats through iron, leaving them hollow and jagged at the edges. Instead, he had poured himself into the land, into the work, into the daily discipline of building something. He had told himself it was enough. He had very nearly convinced himself when the wagon came. It was a hired rig from Tarbo Creek, driven by old Porter Fitch, who ran the livery and supplemented his income ferrying newcomers out to the surrounding homesteads. Porter pulled up in front of Amos's gate and called out, and Amos came around from the back of the house where he had been mending a section of fence, wiping his hands on his trousers, squinting into the October glare. There was a woman sitting on the wagon seat beside Porter, and a single battered trunk lashed in the bed behind her. Winifred Brenner was 25 years old, and she had traveled from St. Louis, Missouri, which was 3 weeks of hard travel by stage and hired wagon from where she now sat. She wore a dark blue dress that had been good once and had weathered the journey with grim dignity, and her dark hair was pinned up under a small hat that was losing its battle with the wind. She was looking at his house and his land with an expression he would later come to understand as her characteristic one, thoroughly assessing, giving nothing away. He had written to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis in the spring. He had sent the letter and then felt so deeply, mortifyingly foolish about it that he had refused to think about it for 4 months. And when the agency had written back confirming that a suitable arrangement had been made, and that a Miss Winifred Brenner would be traveling west in September, he had read the letter in the yard and then sat on his front step for a long time staring at the mountains. She was not what he had expected, though he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that he had not known what to expect. She was not soft or deferential. She thanked Porter Fitch efficiently, declined his offer to carry her trunk, and then walked through the gate and introduced herself to Amos with a directness that was almost startling, extending her hand and saying, "Miss Winifred Brenner, I expect you are Mr. Sawyer." "I am," he said, and shook her hand, which was warm and firm, and that was how it began. The terms of the arrangement were practical and clearly defined. They had been established through correspondence between Amos and the agency, passed along in summary to Winifred. She would come west, they would meet, and if after a period of no less than 30 days they found themselves mutually agreeable, they would be married by the Reverend Elias Drum in Tarbo Creek. She would keep the house and the garden. He would work the cattle. She would have full say over the domestic arrangements and her own person, and he would provide security and permanence and whatever other provisions a man on the frontier could reasonably promise. It was not romantic. Amos had not expected it to be. Romance, he had decided somewhere during those 6 years of solitary work, was a luxury that belonged to people whose lives had not been pared down to essentials. He needed a partner. He needed someone to help make this isolated place livable. He had been honest about that in his letter to the agency, and the agency had apparently passed that honesty along to Winifred, who had her own reasons for wanting a permanent address 3 states away from the one she'd left. He showed her the house, which was clean and spare and smelled of pine. He showed her the garden, which was going dormant for winter but showed signs of having been carefully tended. He showed her the 30-step path to the well. He did not show her the inside of himself, because that was not what had been asked for. She slept in the bedroom. He slept on the cot by the fire in the main room. They were careful with each other, circling at a polite distance like 2 people learning the dimensions of a room in the dark. But Winifred Brenner had not come across 3 states to be polite indefinitely. Within the first week, she had reorganized the kitchen, not intrusively, but efficiently, so that things were simply where they should be rather than where they had accumulated. She asked him questions in the evenings, seated across the table from him with her hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee, questions about the land and the cattle and the layout of the range, and they were not small talk questions. She asked about water rights and the location of neighboring claims and whether the Mescalero trouble that had been in the papers was likely to affect their particular stretch of country. "Not directly," he said. "We are east of the main range lines, and things have been quieter since the agreement at the agency." "Are you certain?" she said. "No," he said, because he respected her enough to be honest. "Not entirely." She nodded and wrote something in a small notebook she kept in her pocket. He did not ask what. The thing that undid him was not a grand gesture. It was not a dramatic moment. It was a Tuesday evening in the third week of October, and she was sitting by the fire after supper mending one of his shirts. She had noticed a fraying cuff and simply picked it up without comment, the way she did most things, and he was supposed to be reading, but instead he was watching her, the way the firelight moved in her dark hair, the small concentrated furrow between her brows as she worked, the particular competent grace with which she handled the needle. And he realized with something very close to alarm that he had been looking for reasons not to like her and had been running out of them for some time. He looked back at his book. His heart was doing something undignified. That was the beginning of the trouble, though he did not call it trouble yet. He called it something easier to manage: appreciation, respect, the natural warmth that develops between two people sharing close quarters and a common purpose. He was very deliberate about not calling it anything else. Winifred, for her part, said nothing to suggest she had noticed any change in him, and this too was characteristic of her. She was not a woman who laid her cards on the table before she had fully assessed the game. What she did do in those first weeks was slowly make the house into something it had never quite been before: a home. Not through decoration or sentiment, but through a series of small, considered acts: the herbs she dried and hung from the kitchen rafters, which made the whole place smell of rosemary and sage; the way she arranged the two chairs beside the fire at an angle toward each other rather than facing it straight on, a change so subtle he almost did not notice it, but which meant that in the evenings they were turned toward each other instead of away. The bread she began baking on Sundays, which filled the house with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. He started sleeping poorly. He lay on his cot in the dark and listened to the silence, and felt the particular specific restlessness of a man who has told himself a story about who he is, and is beginning to sense that the story has a flaw in it. November came, cold and clear, with ice on the water barrel each morning, and the cattle pushing closer to the windbreak fence. Amos spent his days out on the range and his evenings across the fire from Winifred, and the 30-day period of mutual assessment passed without comment from either of them. It was Reverend Drum who finally raised the subject, riding out one gray afternoon to ask, in his practical way, whether they intended to proceed. They were both in the yard when he arrived. Amos was stacking firewood and Winifred was hanging the washing on the line she had strung between two fence posts, and they both stopped what they were doing and looked at the Reverend, and then at each other. "I am prepared to proceed," Winifred said. Her voice was level and her eyes were on Amos. Amos became aware of several things simultaneously: that his pulse was elevated, that Winifred was watching him with that assessing, unreadable expression, and that the correct answer was yes. "As am I," he said. They were married 2 weeks later, on the 12th of November, 1878, in the Tarbell Creek Church, with Reverend Drum officiating and Porter Fitch and his wife Edna as witnesses. Winifred wore her dark blue dress, which she had repaired and pressed. Amos wore the suit he had bought when he first arrived in the territory and had not worn since. It still fit, which he counted as a minor mercy. She said her vows in a clear, steady voice. He said his in the low, deliberate way. He said most important things. Reverend Drum pronounced them husband and wife, and Edna Fitch cried, and Porter shook Amos's hand warmly, and Winifred accepted Amos's offered arm as they walked back out into the pale November light, and he felt the warmth of her hand through his sleeve and thought, "This is real now." What he did not say, could not say, because he had not yet found the shape of it, was that the thought was not frightening. It was terrifying and enormous, and it opened up something in his chest that he had thought had closed permanently. But it was not frightening. It felt, with a surprise that left him almost breathless, like relief. They rode home in the wagon in the fading afternoon, and the sky went from pale gold to rose to purple behind the mountains, and Winifred sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, and somewhere south of the homestead she said quietly, without looking at him, "I think we will do well together, Amos." It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked at the mountains and felt something move through him like warmth. "I believe we will," he said. That night, alone in the bedroom that was now theirs, the thing between them shifted from arrangement to something that resisted naming. He was a man of deep reserve, and she was a woman who did not give herself lightly, and neither of them was the sort to perform emotion they did not feel. And so what happened was less like the sudden opening of a door, and more like the gradual cracking of a window, enough to let the air through, enough to change the quality of everything inside. December was cold and close and bright. They worked side by side more often now, not because the arrangement required it, but because the shape of the days made it natural. She helped him in the mornings with the cattle when the cold was at its worst, and an extra pair of hands made the difference. He helped her carry water when the ground was icy and the path to the well was treacherous. They learned each other's rhythms, that she rose before dawn and needed the first cup of coffee before she was willing to speak, that he tended to push himself past reasonable limits and needed her occasional, unsparing observation of this fact to stop, that she was afraid of nothing she could see and only of things that moved invisibly, at a distance, that he was the inverse of this good in a visible crisis, undone by the slow approach of dread. Christmas came, and Winifred made a molasses cake with dried apples, and Amos brought in a small pine from the slopes and set it in the corner. They did not have ornaments, so she tied pieces of red ribbon to the branches, which she had kept from the wrapping of a package of needles she had brought from St. Louis. It was the most purely tender thing he had ever seen, and he stood in the doorway watching her tie the last ribbon, and felt something he had been carefully not naming press forward so insistently that he had to turn away and go check the water barrel, which was perfectly fine. He admitted to himself in the frozen dark of the yard, in genuine and serious trouble. What he could not determine, what kept him from saying anything, from doing anything beyond the careful warmth he permitted himself in their daily interactions, was whether she felt any corresponding thing. She was warm with him, in her precise way. She laughed at his dry observations. She trusted him with her opinions about everything from the land to the distant politics of Washington, to the personalities of the neighbors they met on their monthly trips to Tarbell Creek. But whether she felt the specific, particular ache that had taken up permanent residence in his chest, he could not tell, and he was afraid to ask, and the fear had its own logic. He had asked her to come here under the terms of a practical arrangement. She had come under those terms. If he now told her that the arrangement had become something else for him, that every evening across the fire and every shared meal and every accidental brush of hands while passing the water bucket had been slowly constructing something enormous and irresistible inside him, she might feel that the terms had been changed without her consent. She might feel trapped. She might feel obligated to respond in kind out of the very decency that was one of the things he most admired about her. And so he said nothing. But the wanting continued to accumulate, and in February, 3 months after their wedding, on a night when a winter storm was pressing against the walls and the fire was the only warm thing in the world, he sat down after she had gone to sleep and wrote it. He had not intended to write it as a letter to her. He had intended to write it as an exercise in managing himself, in getting the feelings out of his chest and onto paper where they could be examined and perhaps diffused. He had seen men do this in the war, write letters home that were never sent because they were too true, too raw, too much. He understood the impulse now. He wrote it by the dying fire in the lowest hour of the night, his handwriting careful and controlled, because his hands were less steady than usual. He wrote about the red ribbon on the Christmas pine and the sound of her voice saying his name for the first time. He wrote about the way she organized a problem, turning it over, examining it from each side, setting it down and picking it up again, and how watching her think was one of the things that had ruined him most completely. He wrote about the particular quality of quiet she brought to the house, which was not emptiness but fullness. He wrote about being afraid, about having spent 6 years building walls and discovering in the space of 4 months that she had walked through all of them without forcing a single one. He wrote, "I love you in a way that I was not prepared for and do not entirely know how to carry, but I would not trade it for the peace I had before." He sat looking at that sentence for a long time. Then he folded the page and slid it under the loose floorboard near the hearth, pressing the braided rug back into place over it, and went to his side of the bed and lay in the dark, listening to her breathe, and did not sleep until dawn. He told himself he would retrieve the letter when he was ready. He told himself ready was coming. He went on telling himself this through March and April, while the world outside slowly softened and the garden came back to life, and Winifred began planning where to put a second vegetable bed, sketching it out at the kitchen table with that focused, interior expression. In March, something happened in Tarbell Creek that temporarily changed the texture of everything. A man named Grady Voss arrived in town. Amos first heard about him from Porter Fitch, who mentioned him on a supply trip with the particular tone of a man withholding his opinion until he had better information. Voss was a land speculator, or said he was a broad-shouldered, well-dressed man from Denver with a letter of credit from a banking concern and a smooth, persuasive manner that got him free drinks at both saloons. He was buying up land titles, or attempting to, particularly from homesteaders whose claims were not fully proven up under the Homestead Act. Amos's claim was fully proven. He had his certificate from the land office. But 2 of his nearest neighbors, a family named Dearborn to the north and an older man named Calhoun to the east, were still in the proving-up period, and Voss had been around to both of them with offers. "What kind of offers?" Amos asked Porter. "The kind that sound generous until you do the arithmetic," Porter said. Amos rode out to see Calhoun the following week and found him troubled and uncertain, the way a man gets when he has been presented with a choice that seems to involve less risk than his present circumstances, but involves surrendering something he has spent years building. Calhoun was 62 and working his land alone since his son had gone back east, and the offer Voss had made him was, on its face, more money than he had seen in a decade. "Don't sign anything yet," Amos said. "Let me look at the actual document first." He brought the matter home and told Winifred about it that evening, and she set down her mending and listened with that complete, focused attention she gave to important things, and then she said, "What does he actually want with the land?" "I don't know yet," Amos said. "That's the problem." "Then that's where we start," she said, and picked up her mending again. They made inquiries. Winifred wrote a letter. She wrote several, actually, with a precision and formality that impressed him, to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, and to a lawyer she knew of in Las Cruces through a correspondence she maintained with a former employer in St. Louis. Amos rode into Tarbell Creek and spoke with Judge Harlan, who was skeptical of Voss on general principles, and with the postmaster, who had taken note of the considerable volume of correspondence going in and out of Voss's room at the boarding house. It took 3 weeks, but what they pieced together was this: Voss was not buying the land for himself. He was acting as an agent for a railroad survey interest, a smaller secondary line that was exploring a southern route through the territory, and the corridor they were considering ran directly through Calhoun's land and the Dearborn claim. The land was worth, if the survey proceeded, several times what Voss was offering. Amos and Winifred drove to Calhoun's place together to tell him. They sat at his kitchen table and Winifred laid out the information in plain language, and Calhoun sat across from her with his hat in his hands, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "So he was trying to cheat me," he said. "He was trying to buy what he knew was worth far more than he was offering," Winifred said, "without telling you why." "That's cheating," Calhoun said. "Yes," Winifred said. "It is." Calhoun did not sell to Voss. The Dearborns, alerted by the same information, did not either. Voss lingered in Tarbell Creek for another 2 weeks and then departed without ceremony, his letter of credit presumably used elsewhere. The railroad survey interest ultimately chose a different corridor further south, so the land never became valuable in the way Voss had anticipated anyway, but that was beside the point. The point was that 2 families kept what was theirs. The incident did something to Amos's understanding of Winifred that the quieter months had been building toward but had not yet crystallized. He had known she was capable. He had known she was smart and unafraid and possessed of a formidable practical intelligence. But watching her sit at Calhoun's table and lay out the facts with that steady, undecorated clarity, watching her treat an old man's dignity as something worth protecting, he understood then that he had married someone genuinely extraordinary, and the love he had been managing and containing since February expanded in his chest to a size that made management feel essentially futile. He was quieter than usual on the drive home. The spring evening was soft and dark blue at the edges, the first fireflies beginning to appear in the low brush. "You are thinking very loudly," Winifred said from the seat beside him. "Am I?" he said. "Whatever it is," she said, without looking at him, "I wish you would say it instead." He did not say it. He drove home and put up the horse and went inside and looked at the braided rug over the floorboard by the hearth, and thought about the letter lying in the dark beneath it, and felt the particular vertigo of a man suspended between the courage he needed and the courage he had. April turned to May. The garden came fully alive, and Winifred began expanding it, adding the second bed she had planned on paper all winter. The work softened her in ways he had not seen in the colder months. She spent long mornings on her knees in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and her hair escaping its pins, and she talked to herself while she worked, or perhaps to the plants, in a low voice he could sometimes catch from the fence where he was doing other things. He found himself inventing reasons to be near the garden. She caught him watching her once, a May morning, golden light, the smell of turned earth, and instead of looking away, she looked back at him steadily for a moment with something in her expression that he could not quite name, and then she said, without any particular inflection, "Are you going to stand there, or are you going to be useful?" He came and knelt beside her in the dirt and helped her plant beans, and their hands worked alongside each other in the warm soil, and once when their fingers touched accidentally over the same seed row, neither of them moved away immediately. It lasted only a moment, that contact, but it rearranged something. June arrived with heat and blue skies that seemed to go up forever, and Amos continued not saying the thing he needed to say, and the letter continued to lie under the floorboard, and the gap between where they were and where he felt certain they could be, if he could only bring himself to cross it, became its own kind of torment. It was in the middle of June that Winifred began the deep cleaning. She had been mentioning it for weeks, a thorough going over of the whole house, the kind of cleaning that gets into corners and under furniture, that she said she had been meaning to do since she arrived but had been putting off until the weather made it bearable to open all the windows. She started on a Monday morning while Amos was out checking the north fence line, moving through the rooms methodically, pulling out furniture, lifting rugs, sweeping into every crevice. Amos returned at midday to find the front door open and the windows raised and Winifred on her knees with a broom in the main room, having pushed the furniture back and pulled up the braided rug. She was crouched beside the hearth. She had the floorboard in her hand. He stood in the doorway and watched, with a feeling of such absolute paralysis that he forgot to breathe, as she set the board aside and looked into the small dark space beneath. He could see the moment she found the letter. She went very still. She reached in and took it out. He watched her unfold it slowly, carefully. The way you handle something you already suspect is important. He watched her read. She read it all the way through, and then she folded it back along its original creases, and she placed it on the kitchen table. She put the floorboard back. She spread the rug over it again. She stood and picked up her broom and went back to sweeping as though nothing had happened. He had been standing in the doorway for all of this without moving, and it was only when she walked to the far side of the room and continued sweeping that he realized she had not yet seen him. He should have spoken then. He should have stepped inside and said something, anything, but the sight of her reading his most secret self, and then simply folding it up and putting it on the table and going back to sweeping had produced in him a confusion so complete that he could not locate the words. He backed away from the door. He went to the barn. He sat on a hay bale in the warm, animal-smelling dark and pressed his palms against his eyes and thought. She read it and left it on the table. What did that mean? He turned it over the way she would examining it from each side. She had left it out. She had not hidden it again. She had not destroyed it. She had placed it on the kitchen table and continued with her day. Was that judgment, dismissal, an invitation? He sat in the barn for an hour and came to no conclusion except that he could not stay in the barn indefinitely. He came back to the house. He came through the door. He saw the letter on the table in the slant of afternoon light. He saw Winifred with her back to him, and then she turned, slowly and deliberately, and looked at him with those dark, assessing, slightly devastated eyes. "You had plenty of time," she said. "You could have handed it to me yourself." "I know," he said. "Then tell me why you didn't." He was quiet for a moment that stretched so long that the fire settled in the grate with a soft, decisive sound. Outside, a red-tailed hawk called once and then was silent. "Because I was afraid," he said. "Because the arrangement we made was clear and practical and fair, and I had no right to change the terms of it without your consent, and what I wrote in that letter, what I wrote is not practical or clear. It is something I did not plan on and cannot seem to manage, and I was afraid that if I handed it to you and you felt differently, you would be trapped, or feel obligated, and that is not something I would be able to bear." Winifred was very quiet. "You were afraid," she said, "that I would be trapped by your honesty." "Yes, but you were not concerned," she said with a precision that cut, "that I might be trapped by your silence." He had no answer for that. He stood and received it because she was right and she deserved the acknowledgement of that. She crossed the room toward him, not quickly, she never moved without intention, and she picked up the letter from the table as she passed it, and she stood in front of him with the page in her hand and her chin level and her eyes on his face with an expression he had never seen from her before. Not the assessing coolness, not the warm practicality, but something open and almost frightened in its openness. "You wrote," she said, "that watching me think was one of the things that ruined you most completely." He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the truth of it had not already said. "I have been," she said carefully, as though selecting each word from a considerable interior debate, "watching you build things, watching you carry things, watching you treat every person Calhoun the Dearborn's that contrary rooster you refuse to eat even though he has attacked me personally twice." A small, involuntary curve of her mouth on this, quickly controlled, with a kind of steady, undemonstrative decency that has been accumulating in me since approximately October. Amos looked at her. "October," he said. "I thought," she said, "it would be manageable. I thought practical people in a practical arrangement would develop practical regard for each other, and that would be sufficient and sensible." Her voice had dropped a degree. "I did not anticipate that you would be the specific person you are." Something was happening in his chest that resembled the moment before a summer storm charged, trembling, the whole world held in suspension. "What kind of person is that?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "The only kind I seem to want," she said. He raised his hand and very carefully, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, touched her face, his thumb at her cheekbone, his fingers at her jaw, and she did not withdraw. She leaned into it the smallest degree, the way a person leans toward warmth, and he felt the breath go out of him. "I love you," he said. The words came out low and direct, stripped of every hedge and qualification because she deserved them without ornament. "I have been trying not to since December, and I have been failing since February, and the letter was my attempt to put it somewhere it would not complicate your life, and I'm sorry I left it there so long." "Don't be sorry," she said. Her hand came up and pressed over his where it lay against her cheek, her fingers curling around his. "I read every word 4 times. He bent his head toward her and she tipped her chin up, and he kissed her in the afternoon light with the letter still in her other hand, and the letter's entire reason for existing dissolved in the space of that contact. And what remained was only this: the warmth of her, the faint smell of rosemary and turned earth and clean cotton, the realness of her in his arms where she had been moving steadily, despite his considerable efforts to prevent it, for the better part of a year. She pulled back first, which was characteristic, and looked at him with her eyes bright and her composure half reassembled, a state he found devastatingly endearing. "Next time," she said, "you will just tell me." "Next time," he agreed, "though I hope there is no particular occasion requiring me to hide love letters under the floor." "I suspect," she said, and the controlled curve of her mouth gave way finally and fully, and it was a smile of such unguarded warmth that it stopped his heart briefly, "that the occasions will find us regardless." That summer was the most fully alive that Amos had ever felt. Something in him, held carefully in check for years and years, not just through the 4 months of their arrangement but through the 6 before it, through all the careful solitude of his self-made frontier life, unclenched. He laughed more readily. He talked more. He found himself reaching for her hand without thinking, and being surprised and grateful to find it there. Winifred, freed of whatever restraint she had maintained under the practical terms she had set herself, was warmer and funnier and more herself turned out to be a person of very considerable depth. She was sharp and she was kind and she was not sentimental but she was tender, and she gave her tenderness in the specific, precise way she gave everything, not lavishly, not carelessly, but as something real and considered that meant all the more for having been chosen deliberately. July brought heat that shimmered off the red earth and turned the distance to liquid, and they sat on the step in the evenings after the day's heat broke, watching the stars come out over the mesa, and she told him about St. Louis, about the millinery shop where she had worked for 3 years, about her landlady Mrs. Ostrovsky, who had been kind and a little sad and had kept cats, about her father who had died when she was 19 and her mother who had married again and moved to Ohio and with whom Winifred maintained a polite and cautious correspondence. "Were you happy there?" he asked. "I was sufficient," she said. "That's different." "Yes," he said, "I know the difference." She looked at him sideways in the dark. "I suspected you would." He told her about Tennessee more than he had told anyone. He told her about Cal, which surprised him, because Cal was a grief he had kept carefully private. He told her about the particular silence of the frontier in the first years, how it had been both a sanctuary and a weight, how he had built this house partly to fill the silence with the sound of work. She listened without interruption, which was one of her gifts, the complete, undivided quality of her attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she put her head against his shoulder, a small and specific gesture, and said nothing because nothing was needed. He pressed his lips to her hair. August was full and golden and busy, and in September Winifred told him, with characteristic directness and no preamble, that she believed she was expecting a child. He set down the bridle he was mending and looked at her. She was watching him with that assessing expression, but underneath it he could see the thing she was working to keep level, hope and fear in equal, complicated measure. "How certain are you?" he asked. "Certain enough to tell you," she said, which from Winifred meant very certain indeed. He was out of his chair before he had consciously decided to move, and he had her hands in his and was looking at her face, and what he felt was enormous and warm and terrifying in the best possible way. "Winifred," he said. "I know," she said, and her composure cracked open slightly at the edges to reveal an entirely unguarded joy. And he wrapped his arms around her and held her in the September kitchen with the afternoon sun warm through the window. And she held him back, her hands pressed flat against his back, and they stood that way for a long time. He insisted on sending for Dr. Abernathy in Tarbell Creek immediately. She said Dr. Abernathy did not need to be bothered. He said Dr. Abernathy was a doctor, and this was precisely what bothered him. They reached the compromise, characteristic of how they now solved most disagreements, of writing to Dr. Abernathy for guidance and arranging a visit for the following month. Dr. Abernathy, a compact and cheerful man in his 50s who had been practicing medicine on the frontier for 20 years, came out in October and confirmed what Winifred had known and said everything was proceeding well, and reminded them that childbirth on the frontier involved certain practical preparations, and that the nearest trained midwife was a woman named Mrs. Guadalupe Torres in the small settlement of San Marcos, 12 miles south, who was very good. Amos rode to San Marcos the following week and introduced himself to Mrs. Torres, who was a warm and practical woman of perhaps 50 with 4 grown children, and the particular unflappable manner of a person who has shepherded many families through their greatest moments of crisis and joy. She agreed to come when needed, and to keep herself available from February onward. Winifred, meanwhile, was handling the pregnancy with the same efficient practicality she brought to everything, and also with a vulnerability she was only beginning to permit. She was tired in the evenings in a way she had not been before, a bone-deep tiredness that surprised her, and she admitted this to him with slight reluctance, as though tiredness were a tactical concession. He learned to simply be present without commentary on it, which was what she needed, not fuss, not excessive concern, just the steadiness of his presence. He worked harder during those months to ensure the homestead was in the best possible order. He banked supplies. He reinforced the root cellar. He brought in more firewood than he thought they could possibly need in a winter because he wanted her warm. He did all of this without much explanation, and she observed it and said nothing, and one evening reached across the table and covered his hand with hers briefly, which was her way of saying, "I see you. I am not taking it for granted." They had long conversations in the evenings during those winter months, longer and more ranging than they had had even in the summer, because the nights were long and the world outside was dark and cold, and the fire and the lamplight and the warmth between them made the house into something small and whole and sufficient. They talked about names. They talked about the kind of people they wanted to raise, the values, not just the practical skills. They talked about the territory and its future, and what the land would look like in 20 years, and whether the railroad, when it finally came, would be more help than disruption. They talked about love, which they had not done very explicitly since the afternoon of the letter, and these conversations were not declarations but examinations. The way she talked about most important things, turning it over, looking at it honestly, asking him to do the same. "Were you in love before?" she asked him once in December. "No," he said. "I thought I was once, when I was 20, but I think I was in love with the idea of being in love, and that is a different thing." "How is this different?" He thought about it carefully. "It is inconvenient," he said. "The other thing was pleasant and uncomplicated. This is large and sometimes alarming. And entirely bound up in your specific person, not an idea of you." She considered this. "That is a reasonable distinction," she said. "Were you?" he asked. "Once," she said. "He was a traveling salesman who came through St. Louis when I was 22. He was charming and handsome and spoke beautifully about a future that turned out to belong to his wife in Cincinnati." Amos was very quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I am not now," she said. She looked at him across the fire. "It taught me to prefer honesty to charm, which was perhaps the most useful thing that has happened to me." He understood from this that the letter had been something she could receive, that its value to her was precisely its honesty, the undecorated truth of it. He was glad, again, that he had written it. He was less glad that it had spent 4 months under a floorboard, but he was finished being sorry for that. He was trying, with Winifred's occasional brisk assistance, to become a man who was finished apologizing for his own feelings. The baby came in late February 1880, on a cold and clear night with the stars very bright over the mesa, and Mrs. Torr's calm, capable presence filling the house. Amos was not permitted in the bedroom, and he did not try to be, but he sat in the main room through the long hours of the night, by the fire, and he did not read or sleep or do anything productive, and he was not ashamed of it. When Mrs. Torrs came to the door and said, in her warm, matter-of-fact way, that he could come in now, he stood so quickly he knocked over his chair. Winifred was exhausted and pale and absolutely herself. He could see it in her eyes, which were tired and bright and direct and entirely hers, and she was holding a small red-faced person who was apparently his son. His son. He sat beside her on the bed and looked at this person, who was very small and very new and seemed thoroughly aggrieved by his own existence, and he felt something he could not have predicted, a love so immediate and unconditional that it bypassed every defense he had ever constructed and simply arrived, whole and enormous, as though it had always been there waiting. "He looks like he disapproves of everything," he managed. "He has just arrived," Winifred said. "Give him time to form opinions." But her voice was tender in a way that made his own throat tight. What shall we call him? She had thought about this. He had thought about this. They had discussed it at length. But in the moment, looking at this small specific person, the name that had risen to the top of the months of discussion came forward clearly. "Callum," she said, "for your brother." He had not suggested Cal's name for the baby. He had thought about it and set it aside, not wanting to put the weight of grief on a new life. Winifred had apparently thought about it differently, not as weight but as continuation. He pressed his mouth to her hair, which was damp at the temple. He could not speak for a moment. "Callum," he said finally. "Yes." Callum Sawyer arrived in the world opinionated and loud, and with a particularly determined expression that Amos recognized, with private amusement, as his wife's face in miniature. He was healthy and growing and thoroughly demanding, and the homestead rearranged itself around him, the way a life rearranges itself around a new true thing. Those first months with Callum were exhausting and astonishing in equal measure. Winifred, who had always been competent, was competent in an entirely new register now. She took to motherhood not with the soft, yielding quality that he had sometimes heard men sentimentalize about, but with her characteristic directness, methodical, informed, adaptive, fiercely committed. She read everything she could find about infant care, which in New Mexico in 1880 was limited, but which she supplemented with relentless practical inquiry directed at Mrs. Torrs on her follow-up visits, and at Edna Fitch on their trips to town. She was also, in the small hours of sleepless nights with Callum, more openly tender than Amos had ever seen her, and he witnessed this sometimes from across the room and felt, again and again, the specific and particular quality of being in love with someone who keeps surprising you. He got up for the nighttime feeding so she could sleep, bringing Callum to her and then taking him back and settling him, and this became one of the rhythms of their life, the nighttime passage of the baby between them, their eyes meeting in the dark over Callum's small head, saying things without words that they were also beginning to say out loud. Spring came and Callum grew, and the garden expanded, and Amos added 4 more cattle to the herd and began thinking about whether to try a small crop of sorghum on the south acreage where the soil was better. He and Winifred talked about this at the table and in the evenings and in the field, she with her notebook and her inquiries, him with his knowledge of the land. They made decisions together, which was how they made everything, not one deferring to the other but both bringing their full selves to the table and working it out between them. In the summer of 1880, a family settled on the unclaimed land to the west, a couple named Harold and Ruth Sommer, who had come from Kansas with 3 children, and a considerable quantity of optimism about the territory's prospects. They were friendly and industrious and slightly overwhelmed by the specific demands of New Mexico land, and Winifred and Amos helped them through the first month in the practical way of frontier neighbors, sharing knowledge, lending tools, sending food when the Sommers' kitchen was not yet established. Ruth Sommer was a lively, sociable woman who made friends easily, and she and Winifred developed a warm friendship with a rapidness that surprised Amos slightly, until he observed that what Ruth offered Winifred was something he could not: female company, easy conversation about domestic matters, the particular ease of being understood by someone who was navigating exactly the same landscape. Winifred came home from afternoons at the Sommer place with a lightness that delighted him. He told her this once, and she raised her eyebrows slightly and said, "You are not threatened by Ruth Sommer." "Of course not," he said, genuinely bemused. "She is your friend." She looked at him for a moment and then said, "You continue to be the specific person you are," which was, he had come to understand, her version of a very profound compliment. The years accumulated: 1880, 1881, 1882, and they were not without difficulty. There was a dry year in which the kitchen garden barely produced, and the cattle needed supplemental feed that strained the supplies. There was a dispute with a new neighbor to the north who claimed a water right over a creek that ran through the upper edge of Amos's land, and the dispute required a trip to Santa Fe, and 3 weeks of legal correspondence that Winifred handled with a formidable precision that resulted in the matter being resolved in their favor. There was a winter illness that swept through Tarbo Creek and caught Callum in its wake. 3 days of a frightened, feverish small child that were the worst days of Amos's life, worse than the lonely years, worse than anything, until the fever broke on the 4th morning, and Callum opened his eyes and demanded, with characteristic imperiousness, something to eat. Amos sat in the bedroom after that and pressed his face into his hands and breathed. Winifred came and sat beside him and put her arm around him, and he leaned into her without self-consciousness, something he had learned to do, to accept comfort as readily as he offered it, which had taken longer to learn than he had expected. She held him and said nothing, because nothing was needed. They were, by the autumn of 1882, 4 years into a life that looked nothing like the practical arrangement they had agreed to, and everything like what Amos had written about in that February letter. The thing that was not practical or clear, the enormous and sometimes alarming reality of being fully, specifically, irreversibly in love with a person. Callum was 2 years old and walking with great enthusiasm into every possible hazard that the homestead presented, and Winifred had told Amos with her customary directness that she believed they might expect another edition in the spring. This time there was no uncertainty about how he felt. He pulled her close in the kitchen and held her and said, "Good." She laughed against his shoulder, which was a sound he still collected internally every time like something precious. "Just good." "Wonderful," he said, "terrifying in the best possible way, large, entirely bound up in your specific person." "You quoted yourself," she said. "I was precise the first time," he said. "There's no improving on precision." She pulled back to look at him with that smile, the fully given one, the unguarded warmth, and he kissed her in the kitchen in the autumn morning light, and Callum, from his position on the floor with a wooden spoon and an upturned pot, made a disapproving noise. "He has opinions about everything," Amos said. "He absolutely does," Winifred agreed, and picked up their son and settled him on her hip, and Callum grabbed a strand of her hair and pulled, which was his current method of expressing both affection and authority. The second baby, born in March 1883, was a girl. She arrived with considerably less drama than her brother, and was from the first a quieter, more watchful person. She had Amos's eyes, a pale, clear gray, and Winifred's habit of observing everything carefully before committing to a response. They named her Eleanor, after Winifred's grandmother on her mother's side, a woman Winifred had described as possessing the rare combination of complete stubbornness and complete kindness. She sounds like someone I would have admired, Amos said. You would have been terrified of her, Winifred said. Everyone was. That was part of the kindness. She made it safe to be terrified and still go on. He looked at his wife holding their daughter in the spring morning. I wonder where you get it, he said. She looked at him over Alina's head. You are going to make me say something sentimental, she warned. I would never, he said. You would, and you enjoy it, she said, and she was right, and he smiled, and she tried not to and failed. Tarbo Creek was growing, those years in the early 1880s, in the way that frontier towns grew when the surrounding land proved its productivity and more families came. A second doctor arrived, a young man named Whitfield who set up a practice and proceeded to fall in love with and eventually marry Judge Harlan's youngest daughter. A proper school opened, no longer sharing space with the church, in a small building on the main street, with a school teacher imported from Texas named Miss Agatha Burr, who was formidably educated and deeply committed to the children of the territory receiving a real education. Winifred was one of the founding members of the committee that had advocated for the school, and she and Amos both attended the dedication. Callum in Amos's arms at first, and then, when Callum's wriggling made carrying him impractical, planted firmly on his own feet and given strict instructions that he absorbed and cheerfully ignored. Standing in the new schoolroom, the smell of fresh-cut pine and new chalk, Winifred beside him with Alina on her hip and Callum now holding his father's hand with the particular grip of a child who is pretending not to be interested while being intensely interested. Amos looked around at this place and these people and felt the specific, grounded weight of belonging somewhere. He had not had that since Tennessee. He had not expected to find it again. He had come to New Mexico running from absence and had stayed to build something and had been building, without quite knowing it, toward this. On the drive home from the school dedication, with the afternoon long and golden and the children asleep against each other in the wagon bed, Winifred tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and leaned slightly against his shoulder, which was her version of an embrace in a public conveyance. He covered her hand with his. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am glad I came," she said. He pressed his hand more firmly over hers. "So am I," he said. "Winifred." She tilted her head to look up at him. The afternoon light was in her dark hair and her eyes were warm and direct and entirely hers. "The first time you said my name," she said, "I thought, this is a man who says things carefully." "And was I," he said, "careful enough?" She considered this with the seriousness she gave to everything worth considering. "You were too careful," she said, "for longer than necessary." But then, and here the controlled smile gave way again, as it gave way for him regularly now, and it was still, after years, the thing that made the world feel entirely right. When you stopped being careful, you were entirely worth waiting for. He had no words for what that cost her to say, and what it meant to him that she said it. He settled for pressing his lips to her temple, slow and deliberate, and she permitted it with a softness that was the furthest thing from permission. It was want, mutual and equal and freely given. That evening, after the children were asleep, Callum in his small bed, Alina in her crib, both of them breathing with the complete relaxed abandon of the very young, Amos and Winifred sat on the step in the warm autumn dark, as they so often had, and the stars came out over the mesa the way they always did, indifferent to human happiness and therefore no less beautiful. "Alina will be in school before long," Winifred said. 3 years yet," he said. "Time moves faster than that implies," she said. He looked at the stars. "Is that an observation or a proposal?" She was quiet for a moment. The night insects were loud in the low brush. A coyote called once, distantly, and then silence. "Both, perhaps," she said, and there was in her voice the careful quality she had when she was working toward something specific, turning it over in her hands the way she turned over everything important. He waited because she would get there. "I think," she said, "that I would like for Callum and Alina to have a larger family around them than the one we have built so far. And I think that the homestead can support it. The sorghum crop has done well and the herd is larger than it has been. And I think," a pause, a breath, the particular slight unsteadiness she allowed herself only when she was about to say something that exposed her completely, that I am happy, in a way that I want more of, in a way that I would like to make more room for. He turned to look at her profile in the dark. "Is that," he said quietly, "your way of saying you want another child?" She turned and met his eyes. "It is my way of saying I want this life to keep expanding, in whatever direction it wants to go." He took her hand between both of his. Her fingers were warm and familiar and entirely real. "Then we'll let it," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He felt her exhale, the specific exhale of a person setting down something they have been carrying. He rested his cheek against her hair and looked at the stars above the mesa, above the land they had built their life on, above the house where their children slept, and where a braided rug covered a floorboard that no longer hid anything, because everything that had been hidden there had been found and placed on the table and spoken out loud in the afternoon light. The third child was born in the summer of 1885, another boy, who came in the hottest month and had, from his first hours of life, the temperament of someone deeply untroubled by the world's opinion. They named him Theodore, and from the beginning he was called Theo, and he was cheerful and sociable in a way that was quite unlike either of his parents and very much like Ruth Sommer's most spirited daughter, which Winifred observed with amusement. Callum was 5 by then, and Alina was 2, and the house was full in a way that should have been overwhelming, and was instead simply full, loud and warm and alive with the specific chaos of children who are loved and know it, and therefore take up their full space in the world without apology. Amos built on to the house that year. He added a second bedroom with help from Harold Sommer, and a young man from town named Marcus Webb who was handy with timber and glad of the work. The addition meant Callum had his own room and Alina and Theo shared, and the house felt different, larger, more established, more permanent, as though it had made a decision about itself. Porter Fitch died in the autumn of 1885, of a stroke that came without warning on a Tuesday morning, and his death was genuinely mourned by half the territory because he had driven people in and out of Tarbo Creek for 20 years and had been, in his quiet and reliable way, the connective tissue of the community. Edna Fitch sold the livery to Marcus Webb, who ran it well, and moved to live with her sister in Colorado. Amos and Winifred both attended the funeral, and on the way home Amos said, "He drove you out to me the first day." "He called you a careful man," Winifred said. "On the drive out, he said, 'He is a careful man, Miss Brenner, and careful men are rare and worth knowing.'" Amos was quiet for a moment. He was a perceptive man. "He was," she said. "I thought about it the whole rest of the way and decided it could mean either something very good or something very frustrating." "And which did it prove to be?" She turned to look at him. Her eyes were warm and direct and full of everything they had built, 5 years of it with more to come. "Both," she said, "and entirely worth it." The years after 1886, 1887, moving into the latter part of the decade, settled into the richness of a life that has found its shape and is now being lived in it rather than assembled. Callum started school and came home full of Miss Burr's lessons and the particular social drama of children navigating their world. Alina was quiet and observant and began, at 4, to ask questions of such precision that Winifred started keeping a record of them in her notebook. Theo remained thoroughly pleased with existence and communicated this pleasure loudly and without cease. Amos and Winifred had their disagreements, because they were two strong-minded people in close quarters, and because real life is not a truce but a negotiation, ongoing and sometimes heated. They disagreed about how much risk to accept in expanding the herd. They disagreed about whether to apply for a post office designation for their area, which would have meant more responsibility than Amos thought they needed, and Winifred thought they absolutely should take on because it would improve everyone's lives. She was right about the post office, which they got in 1887, and she noted this without excessive emphasis, which was generous of her and which he told her so. They argued sometimes late at night, with the kind of honesty that long intimacy makes possible, not cruel, not careless, but unguarded in a way that requires trust, because only a person you trust completely gets to see you actually angry. And after the argument, which always resolved, because they were both, when it came to it, more committed to the other person than to their own position, there was always the return to each other, which was, in its own way, the best part. "You are infuriating," she told him once, after a particularly circular argument about the sorghum acreage. "I know," he said. "So are you." "I know," she said, and the impossibility of remaining truly angry at each other broke through both of them simultaneously, and she pressed her forehead to his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her, and they stood in the kitchen in this posture of mutual exasperation and mutual love, which was, he thought, a fairly honest portrait of what it was to be genuinely in the life of another person. In 1888, Reverend Drum, who had been the minister of the Tarbell Creek Church for 12 years, retired and moved to live with his daughter in Arizona. At his farewell dinner, which was attended by most of the town, he made a short speech in which he talked about the community he had watched grow, and he talked about the Sawyer family specifically, mentioning Amos and Winifred with a warmth that made Winifred press her lips together to contain something. Afterward, outside in the cool evening, Amos said, "He spoke very well of you." "Of us," she said. "Of you specifically," he said, because Drum had, in fact, singled out Winifred's work on the school committee and her assistance with the Voss matter a decade earlier, and her general contribution to the character of the community. Amos was proud with a fullness that had nothing of possessiveness in it, proud the way you are proud of something real and true, not something you own. "Stop it," she said, but her voice was unsteady at the edges in the way it got when she was moved. "I won't," he said. She took his hand and held it. They stood in the dark outside the church where they had been married 9 years earlier, and the night was soft and the stars were beginning, and their children were inside with Ruth Sommer's family, and the future stretched ahead of them full and wide. Callum was 8, and had recently announced with great seriousness that he intended to become a doctor. Alina was 5 and had opinions about everything, particularly about the correct method of organizing any given system, a quality that was clearly hereditary. Theo was 3 and very much Theo, which was its own complete and singular category. Amos said, "We have made something here." "We have," Winifred said, and then, "Amos." "Yes. That letter," she said. "Did you ever get it back from me?" He thought about this. He had not. It had sat on the table, and then she had presumably, he had never actually asked. "What did you do with it?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, and in the dark he could sense her considering whether to answer directly or to make him wonder a moment longer, which was a particular quality of hers he had come to love. "I have it," she said. "All this time." "All this time," she said. "I put it in the small cedar box with my grandmother's brooch and my father's watch, the things I keep." He looked at her in the dark, the things she kept. He was in that box in his most frightened and most honest voice, alongside the people she had loved and lost and chosen to carry forward. "The things I keep," he repeated. "Yes," she said simply. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the way he sometimes did, slowly and deliberately, and she let him. "I would write it again," he said. "Every word. I would write it now and not wait 4 months to give it to you." "I know," she said, and the warmth in her voice was something he had been collecting for 9 years and would go on collecting, he thought, with God's grace for a great many more. "I know you would." They walked back inside together, back to the noise and warmth and the children who were his and hers and already, at their various ages, becoming the people they would be, Callum with his serious medical aspirations, and Alina with her organizing intelligence, and Theo with his uncontainable joy, and Amos held the door for his wife, and she walked through, and he followed, the way he always followed, not behind but alongside, in the specific particular rhythm of two people who have learned each other completely and are still, every day, learning more. Spring of 1890 brought a letter of its own, a real one. This time, correspondence sent through the proper channels and received through the new post office, from a contact of Winifred's in Santa Fe who was involved in a women's educational initiative for the territory. They were looking for contributors to a small publication meant to advise new settlers, particularly women coming west, on the practical realities of frontier life, and Winifred's name had been suggested. She read the letter at the kitchen table, and then set it down and looked at Amos with the thoughtful expression she wore when she was already halfway into a decision. "They want me to write about what it is actually like," she said. "And what is it actually like?" he said. She looked around the kitchen at the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, at the two chairs angled toward each other by the fire, at the evidence of children's presence in the muddy boots by the door and the wooden toys stacked in the corner. She looked at him. "Harder than I expected," she said. "Better than I imagined possible." A pause, more surprising in every direction. "That is very honest," he said. "It is the only thing worth writing," she said. She wrote for the publication, and her contributions were clear and specific and entirely characteristic of her, practical to the core, with an honesty about difficulty that was balanced by an equal honesty about what the difficulty was for. Several women wrote back to the publication about her pieces specifically, and two of them wrote to her directly through the post office, beginning correspondences that would last years. Amos read her contributions with a pride and love that had become indistinguishable from each other. He told her she wrote the way she thought, directly, without waste, with everything in the right place. "You are biased," she said. "Completely," he said. "But also correct." In the summer of 1890, 12 years after Winifred had arrived on Porter Fitch's wagon with a single trunk and an expression that gave nothing away, the homestead was a different place entirely. The house was larger. The land was productive. The cattle were a real herd. The garden was extensive and well-established, familiar enough now that Winifred moved through it with the ease of long knowledge. The children were Callum, nearly 10, and in correspondence with a doctor in Las Cruces who had agreed to answer his questions. Eleanor, 7 and already the most organized person in the Sawyer household, and Theo, 5, who had recently decided that horses were the most interesting animals in existence, and that all of his future plans should be organized around this fact. On a July evening that year, warm and clear and smelling of sage and dry grass, Amos and Winifred sat on the step as they had so many evenings, the children inside, the stars beginning over the mesa. She said, "Do you ever think about the man you were when I arrived?" He considered this. "Sometimes," he said. Was alone. He was building something and not sure for whom. He was building it for himself, she said. "That is not nothing." "No," he said, "but it is less than this." She leaned against him in the warm dark, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the comfortable, particular quiet of two people who have long since stopped needing to fill silence with anything other than presence. After a while she said, "I think Eleanor has your persistence. She has your organizing ability," he said. "She has both," Winifred said. "She is going to be formidable." "She already is," he said. Winifred laughed, the real laugh, full and unguarded, and he felt it against his side and tightened his arm around her and thought, This is what the letter was trying to say and could not, because it was not yet the thing it was describing. The thing was only beginning, and he could not have known then how large it would grow. He could not have known how completely it would fill the space where the loneliness had been and leave no room for anything else. He pressed his lips to her temple, slow and deliberate. She turned and looked at him in the dark, and her eyes were warm and direct and entirely, completely hers. "Amos," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad you wrote that letter," she said. "Even as I am glad I found it. Even as I am glad you were too afraid to give it to me, because then I got to find it myself and decide for myself what to do with it and put it with the things I keep." He looked at her. The stars were coming in overhead, the great wide canopy of them, the same stars above the same mesa they had looked at for 12 years. "What does it mean," he said, "to be a thing you keep?" She held his gaze. She held it with the complete, undivided attention she gave to everything truly worth her time. "It means," she said, "that you are not temporary. It means that I have looked at you from every angle in every season and found nothing I wish to set down. It means," and here the controlled precision of her voice softened to something very quiet and very true, "that you are mine, Amos Sawyer, in the way that the things in that box are mine. Permanent, chosen, not put away but kept." He said nothing. He simply looked at her, this woman who had come out of a wagon with a single trunk and an unreadable expression, and had, over years of careful and sustained and extraordinary living, become the center of gravity around which everything else in his life orbited. He kissed her slowly, as he did things that mattered, and she kissed him back, and the stars came fully out over the mesa, and inside the house a child called out in a dream and was still again. They stayed on the step a little longer in the warm summer dark, in the life they had built from nothing, and a letter hidden under a floorboard, and the specific and irreplaceable courage of a woman who had found it, read it, and placed it on the table, not as an accusation and not as a question, but as an answer, clear and final and entirely hers to give. And from that table, from that moment, everything had been out in the open. And from that openness, everything had grown. The years would continue. There would be hard ones and good ones and ones that were both at once. Callum would one day study medicine as he intended. Eleanor would grow into exactly the formidable person her parents foresaw. Theo would love horses his entire life and become, in time, a man whose laugh filled whatever room he was in. There might be more children. They were not finished with that conversation, and the conversation had always been good, or there might not, and either way there would be the particular, irreplaceable fullness of what they already had. But that was the future, and the future would come as it came. What Amos Sawyer had, sitting on the step in the summer dark of 1890, was this: a woman who kept him in a cedar box alongside everything she loved, a life that was more than he had known how to want, and a floorboard near the hearth under a braided rug that held nothing anymore, because everything worth hiding had finally been spoken, and everything spoken had become the whole and breathing world.